They said the dead did not return to claim what they were owed, yet on the morning the Vale judged Senna a witch. Half the square swore later that something old had turned its head toward Ashvale Hold and waited. The accusation took 4 words: witch spawn, like her mother. Steward Corin Vass spoke them from the dais with his chain of office bright against the cold, and the crowd, who had wanted a reason to look away from their own dying king for one single morning, gave him their silence as agreement. Senna stood in the square with her wrists unbound, because no one had thought a girl who fainted at the sight of her own blood needed binding, and she did not look down at the frost cracking under her boots. The whole of Ashvale Hold seemed to have turned out for it, huddled in their winter wool with their breath fogging in white clouds above their heads, the way they had once gathered for her mother and would likely gather again for whatever the wood eventually did to her. A child near the front threw a clod of frozen mud that struck her shoulder and did not hurt half so much as the laughter that followed it. She looked at the gate instead, at the black wood beyond the wall where her mother's ashes had been scattered 9 winters before, and she did not flinch when the steward named her sentence. Cast out. Before the hollow night, before the dying could finish dying. What the square did not know, what even Corin Vass did not yet understand he had set loose, was that 3 miles past that gate, in a keep gone quiet with grief, the most powerful wolf in the north was lying in his own sickbed, with a curse eating the marrow from his bones, and that he would let no healer near him. Physicians had come from as far as the eastern hold and been turned away within the hour, their satchels of remedies untouched, their reputations as healers no protection at all against a king who would rather die unattended than be tended by hands he did not trust. No healer but one. She did not yet know how this story would end. You might, if you stay close to the telling. In the year 1140, in the dead heart of a winter that had killed the river twice, Ashvale Hold counted its days by how many of its wolves still rose each morning, and that morning the answer had been 1 fewer than yesterday. Senna had lived 24 winters at the edge of the wall, the way a weed grows at the edge of a road, tolerated because pulling it took more effort than it was owed. Her mother, Ailsa, had been a healer once, trusted enough to tend the old king's hounds and the young king's fevers both, until a sickness swept the lower village 9 winters past, and someone needed a name to put to the dying. They had burned Ailsa's herbs in the square and her body in the wood, and they had let her daughter live only because a 6-year-old girl made a poor enough scapegoat that even Corin Vass, newly risen to steward then, had hesitated. He had not hesitated today. Senna walked through the gate with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, because old Hesper had told her once, in the years since, that the Vale could take a roof, and a name, and a mother, but it could not take the way a woman chose to hold her own spine, and that was the only inheritance worth keeping. The gate groaned shut behind her with a sound like a held breath finally let go. She did not look back at the square. She had already memorized it. The dais where the steward stood. The frost-white faces of people she had grown up beside, who had eaten bread from her mother's hands and now would not meet her eyes. Lady Iseult Marrow at the front in furs the color of spilled wine, lips curved in something too pleased to be called pity. What Senna had not memorized, because she had not been permitted close enough to see it, was the room 3 corridors deep in the keep, where the king of Ashvale Hold lay dying by inches, and where no healer the steward sent had been able to so much as touch him without the king's own guards dragging them back out by the collar. She would learn that soon enough, for now there was only the wood, black and waiting, and the cold pressing its hand flat against her chest, like it meant to keep her heart from arguing. She found old Hesper's hut by the smoke before she found it by the path, a thin gray thread rising between black trunks like a single gray hair on a dark coat. The only sign that anyone at all still lived this deep into ground the Vale had long since stopped claiming. Hesper had been exiled longer than Senna had been alive, banished in a steward's purge 2 generations back for the crime of curing a lord's gout with the wrong color of root, and she had outlived every person who had cast her out by a margin she found, by her own account, extremely satisfying. She did not ask why Senna had come. She only opened the door wider and said, "Come in before the wood decides you belong to it instead of me," and that was the whole of the welcome Senna received on the worst day of her life, and it was enough. The hut itself was small and close, and smelled of dried roots and wood smoke, herbs hanging in bundles from the low rafters, a single tallow candle guttering on a shelf crowded with jars Senna recognized from her mother's own kitchen, the same shapes, the same careful handwriting on the labels, as though Hesper had spent 9 years quietly keeping a dead woman's knowledge alive in case her daughter ever came looking for it. That night Hesper fed her broth that tasted of nothing and everything, and told her plainly what the rest of the veil only whispered. The king was dying. Not of age, not of any hurt a blade could open, but of something slow and patient eating him from the inside, and every healer sent in to look at him had come out white-faced and empty-handed, because the king would let none of them near enough to try. "None but you, perhaps," Hesper said, and did not explain herself further that night. The summons came 2 mornings later, carried by a guard with old frost in his beard, who looked at Senna the way men look at something they have been ordered to fetch and would rather not touch. "Steward Vass required her at the keep," he said, and the words required and steward sat strangely together in his mouth, as though he did not quite believe the order had come from where it claimed to. Hesper's eyes had narrowed at that. "Be a mouse," she told Senna at the door. "See everything. Say nothing. Touch nothing you are not told to touch, and touch what you are told to with both hands, because half of healing is in believing your own fingers no more than your fear does." The keep of Ashvale Hold rose gray and ancient above the frozen river, its banners hanging stiff and colorless in air too cold to let them move, and Senna had not set foot inside it since she was a girl small enough to be carried on her mother's hip while Elsa tended the kennels. It smelled the same. Wood smoke, old stone, the particular mineral chill of a building that had stood through more winters than its people. Her boots rang too loudly on the flagstones for her own comfort, and she kept her eyes fixed on the back of the guard's cloak rather than on the servants who paused in doorways to watch her pass, their faces unreadable in the dim torchlight. Corin Vass met her in a corridor lined with the portraits of kings, his chain of office catching torchlight in a way that seemed designed for exactly that purpose. "You will go to him," he said without preamble, "because the council has run out of healers willing to try, and a witch spawn is cheaper to lose than a trained one, and if he dies with your hands on him, the wood already knows your name." The threat lay under the sentence so plainly that he did not bother dressing it as anything else. Senna said nothing, because Hesper had told her to say nothing, and she let a guard walk her deeper into the keep than she had ever been allowed to go, past chambers shuttered for winter, and a hall hung with old hunting banners gone dull with smoke. The air changed before the door did. She felt it the way one feels a storm 2 valleys off, a pressure low in the chest, a thickening of something she had no name for. The guards outside the king's chamber were armed and grim and did not speak to her at all, and when the door opened she understood, in the space of one breath, exactly what kind of silence a dying king could fill a room with. He had worn the Iron Crown 12 years and worn it well, by every account she had ever heard, until the wine he trusted began to turn against him. He lay propped against a mountain of furs gone dark with sweat, and even diminished, even gray-skinned and hollow at the eyes, he filled the chamber the way a held storm fills a sky before it breaks. His hair was black and matted to his brow. A beard he had clearly not had the strength to tend, roughened a jaw that even illness had not managed to soften into anything gentle. A great black wolf lay curled at the foot of the bed, ears pricked toward the door, watching her with an attention far too steady for an ordinary animal. His eyes opened when she crossed the threshold, and something in them, some animal awareness buried under the fever, fixed on her the way a hand closes around a thing it has been reaching for in the dark. "Get out," he said to the guard, not to her, in a voice scraped raw and barely above a rasp. "No more." The guard hesitated, glanced at Senna, and made to take her arm. "She is staying," the king said, and this time his eyes had not left Senna's face at all. No one in the room seemed to know what to do with a command that contradicted every healer he had refused before her, least of all Senna, who stood very still and did not trust the sudden steadying of her own pulse. She crossed the floor anyway, because Hesper's voice was in her ear even 3 miles away, telling her that fear was a poor reason to fail at the one thing she had been brought here to do, and that a trembling hand healed no one, least of all the woman attached to it. Up close, the rot under his skin showed itself plainly, a grayness threading from a mark at his collarbone outward like frost spreading across a window pane. And she understood within 3 breaths that this was no fever and no ordinary blight. It moved the way a thing moves when it has been fed on purpose. She asked for water, clean linen, and the smallest, least important thing she could think to ask for, which was permission to touch the mark itself. He gave it with a single nod, and when her bare fingers finally pressed against the cold gray skin at his collarbone, something happened that she would spend the rest of that long winter trying and failing to explain to herself in words that did not sound like madness. Warmth. Not his. Hers. Rising from some place beneath her ribs she had never had cause to name, rushing down through her arm and into her fingers and into him. A single bright thread of heat in a body gone cold from the inside out. He drew a breath sharp enough to startle the guard still hovering at the door, and for one unguarded instant his whole ruined face opened in something that was not pain. She told herself it was only the fever breaking a degree. She told herself that for 3 more days. The steward did not trust her any more for the king's recovering color. If anything, her presence in the keep seemed to sharpen something in him, a watchfulness that followed her down every corridor like a second shadow. He set her to scrub floors between her hours in the sick room, as though to remind the whole keep what she was beneath whatever use the king had found for her, and the household took its cue from him readily enough. "Witches get does well enough scrubbing floors, I find," Corin said one morning, loud enough for the whole hall to hear as he passed her on his way to council, and a ripple of laughter followed him that Senna let wash past her without raising her head from her work. She scrubbed the floor and said nothing, because nothing was the only currency she had that no one could take from her twice. Garrow found her there more than once, the king's second in command pausing in his rounds with his hand resting on his sword belt and an expression on his weathered face that she could not quite read. Somewhere between suspicion and a grudging, unwilling curiosity. He had served Halric since they were both boys running wild in the same training yard, and he did not speak to her directly for the better part of a week, only watched, the way a man watches weather he cannot yet name, but already distrusts the shape of. When he finally did speak, it was only to tell her, low and without explanation, that the king had eaten a full meal for the first time in a month, and to ask, without quite asking, what she had done to cause it. Lady Iseult found her in the same corridor not long after, trailing 2 of her own ladies and a faint, cold smile. "I hear the Ash Girl has the king eating from her own hand now," she said, to no one in particular, and to Senna entirely. How fortunate that desperation lowers a man's standards so conveniently. Senna kept her eyes on her bucket and her hands steady on the brush, and said nothing at all, because Isolt's words cost her nothing she had not already paid in the square 9 winters past, and a debt already paid in full owed no further interest to anyone. What she did not say to anyone What she barely let herself think in the privacy of her own skull was that each evening when she returned to the sick room, the king was a fraction more present behind his own eyes, and that twice now she had caught him watching her work from the doorway with an attention that had nothing to do with his ailment at all, a held look that lingered a beat past what courtesy required, and that neither of them moved to break first. Once he had ordered, in a rasp still rebuilding itself into a voice, that the girl be given a proper meal and a blanket from his own stores, rather than whatever the kitchens deigned to spare her, and the steward's jaw had gone tight enough to crack a walnut. "It is for the patient's benefit that the healer eats," the king had said, when Corin questioned the order, and had not looked at Senna at all while he said it, which she noticed, because by then she had begun noticing everything about the careful places he chose not to look. The gray mark on the king's collarbone slowed its spread under her hands, but did not retreat. And by the second week, Senna understood that whatever she carried in her own blood could ease the rot, but not unmake it. She needed more than warmth and will. She needed ember balm, the silver-leafed plant her mother had once kept dried in jars along the windowsill, the one substance Senna had ever heard named as a true cure for a curse laid deep enough to outlast ordinary medicine. And the only place it grew wild in the whole of the vale was the standing stones at the heart of the hollow wood, a half-day's walk past the edge even Hesper called dangerous. If a debt paid quietly has ever mattered more to you than one paid in front of an audience, you already understand why she went back into that wood a second time. The rest of the vale would understand it far more slowly. She went at night, when the keep slept, and no one would mark her absence from the kitchens until dawn. The wood past the stones belonged to nothing tame. Ice wolves ran there, true wild wolves untouched by pack law, and twice she heard them moving parallel to her path in the dark, patient and unhurried, the way a thing moves when it knows exactly how little hurry it needs. Her lantern guttered low in the wind, and she did not dare relight it for fear of what the flame might draw, so she walked the last half-mile by starlight alone, counting her own breaths to keep the cold from closing her throat entirely. Once, crossing a frozen streambed, she froze entirely as a shape paler than the surrounding snow resolved itself into a wolf standing not 20 paces off, head low, eyes catching what little light there was. She did not run. Hesper had told her that running was the one mistake the wood never forgave, and so she stood very still with her heart slamming against her ribs until the wolf, after a long, unbearable moment, turned and melted back into the trees as though she had not been worth the trouble after all. She found the stones by moonlight and the silver leaves growing pale and stubborn out of frozen ground at their base, and she knelt in snow that soaked through to her knees and filled both hands before her courage gave out and sent her running the whole way back, heart slamming, certain at every step that the wood had decided after all to keep what it was owed. She did not tell the king what it had cost her to bring him the cure. She told him only to hold still and press the crushed silver leaf against the gray mark with her bare palm, and felt the same bright thread of warmth pour out of her and into him, stronger this time, enough that he gasped and gripped the furs hard enough to split the seam. "Why?" he asked her afterward, in the rebuilt rasp of a voice no longer quite so ruined. Why would a woman the veil cast out half freeze herself in a wolfwood for a king who never once spoke a kind word to her before this room? She considered lying to him, the way she had learned to lie to everyone in the veil who asked her a question with a trap folded inside it, and found, looking at his face in the low firelight, that she did not particularly want to. "Because someone should have done it for my mother," Senna said, and did not soften the answer, and watched something crack open behind his eyes that he closed again almost as fast as it had shown itself. "You are not your mother's debt to pay," he said quietly, after a silence that stretched longer than either of them seemed to expect. "No," she agreed. "I am only the one left standing close enough to pay it." She learned the shape of the conspiracy by accident, The way most true things in Ashvale hold seem to surface, sideways and unintended. Returning late from the standing stones with her apron still damp and her fingers half numb from cold, she took the servants' passage behind the council chamber to avoid the watch at the main hall, and found the steward's voice carrying through a door left open a careless inch. The stone at her back was colder than her own skin by then, and she pressed herself against it without meaning to, as though the wall itself might hide her better than the shadows already did. The grey rot will finish him by the hollow night if the dose holds, Corinvas was saying, low and satisfied, to someone Senna did not recognize by voice alone. The council of 12 names a regent before midnight on the longest dark of the year, and a regent who has already arranged passage of the eastern grazing lands to Stonepine will find himself very well rewarded indeed. Night root and silvered ash, the other voice said. A slighter, oilier voice she would later learn belonged to a physician long in Corin's pocket. Wine alone could not carry that dose for 3 winters without a death sooner. You are fortunate his constitution held as long as it did. Fortunate, Corin said and laughed. A short, ugly sound is not the word I would choose for a king foolish enough to trust the man pouring his cup. He has worn that crown 12 years and never once thought to ask who benefited most from his continued goodwill toward his own steward. That is the failing of kings who believe loyalty is owed rather than bought. Senna pressed herself flat against the cold stone of the passage and did not breathe until their footsteps faded the other way, and walked back to the sick room with her whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She told the king everything that same night, in the careful murmur reserved for a room with thin walls, and watched the last softness leave his face entirely. He did not rage. He went very still instead, the stillness of a wolf gone quiet before it moves, and when he spoke again his voice had none of the rasp left in it at all. Say nothing of this to anyone but Hesper, he told her. Not the guards. Not Garrow, not yet. A man clever enough to poison a king for 3 winters unnoticed has ears in walls I have not yet found. She was aware of him in ways she had no practice naming that night, the heat radiating off his skin despite the rot's lingering cold beneath it. The particular low note in his voice when he spoke quietly rather than for a room. Her own pulse climbing to match the pace of his breathing, despite the width of the chamber still between them, as though some part of her had already decided the distance was smaller than it looked. When he reached for her hand just before she left him to whatever rest the rot would allow, his fingers closed around hers with a grip far steadier than a dying man's had any right to hold, and he did not let go for the space of 3 full breaths. He drew her hand toward him slowly enough that she could have pulled away at any point along the way, and for one suspended moment she thought he meant to press his mouth to her knuckles, his head bending, his breath warm enough across her skin that her own caught somewhere high in her chest. A knock at the door broke it before either of them moved further, Garrow's voice calling through the wood to ask whether the king required anything before the watch changed, and Halric released her hand at once, the careful distance of king and healer dropping back over him like a cloak, pulled hastily into place. Something close to an apology crossed his face before he could smooth it away entirely. That was the second crack, and she carried the shape of his hand home with her, like a coal kept lit against the cold. Corinvas was not a foolish man, whatever his cruelty, and within days he had marked the king's slow climb back from the edge of death and traced its cause to the one variable that had changed. He came to the sick room himself the morning before Hollow Night, flanked by 2 guards and the oily physician, and this time he did not bother with threats dressed as orders. The council has heard troubling reports, he announced, loud enough for the corridor to carry it, that the king's condition has worsened under unsanctioned and unsupervised treatment by a known witch's daughter, treatment that conveniently leaves him weaker by morning each time her hands have touched him. That is a lie, Senna said, before she could stop herself, And the steward's smile told her she had given him exactly the outburst he had come to provoke. Behind him, the oily physician produced a small vial from his coat, holding it aloft for the gathering corridor to see, claiming it had been found beneath her cot in the servants' quarters, though Senna had never laid eyes on it before that moment. "A witch's daughter accusing her betters of lying," he said, to the corridor at large, to the gathering knot of servants and guards who had paused to watch. "Ashblood. The whole hold has heard the name before, and the whole hold knows what became of the last woman who wore it." The king, still too weak to rise unassisted, could only watch from the bed as the steward ordered her seized, his voice rising for the first time in weeks into something that cracked the stone calm he had held since learning of the poison. "Vasa," he said, "you will regret this hour for the rest of whatever life I leave you." "Threaten away, my king," the steward said, with the particular gentleness of a man who believes he has already won. The council convenes at the Hollow Night Vigil, and a confession of regicide, even an unwilling one, tends to be very persuasive to a frightened assembly. By midnight you will either be dead of her poison or alive enough to thank me for catching her before she finished the work, and either way, the regency falls to the steward who protected the throne. I find I am equally content with both outcomes. They took Senna to the lowest cell beneath the keep, a room with no window and a door barred from the outside, the stone floor so cold it burned through her skirts within minutes of sitting, and it was there, hours later, that a guard she did not recognize brought word meant to break what little resolve the cold and the dark had left her. The steward's men had ridden into the hollow wood that afternoon, the guard said, almost kindly, almost sorry, and brought back the old woman who lived among the stones, on the charge of harboring and instructing a known witch. Hesper, bound at the wrists, was being held in the yard above, and would be named co-conspirator at the vigil unless Senna confessed before the full council to poisoning the king herself. Senna sat on the cold stone floor with her knees drawn to her chest and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so many days of fear, that the steward had built a trap with no honest door out of it. Confess, and Hesper lived while the king died believing her a poisoner. Refuse, and both women would be named guilty regardless, and the king would be dead of the rot by the time anyone troubled to ask whether the council had judged fairly at all. She thought of Hesper's voice at the door of that hut 3 months past, telling her that no one could take the way a woman chose to hold her own spine, and she found, sitting alone in the dark with her hands gone numb and her future narrowed to a single locked door, that the words had not lost any of their truth for how much colder the stone had grown since. She thought of her mother's ashes scattered outside the wall 9 winters past, of a 6-year-old girl who had not understood yet what the word witch could be made to mean in a frightened mouth. And she thought that she had perhaps always known the wood would ask this price of her eventually, only not so soon, and not with so much more now left to lose than there had been then. When the guards came for her at the turn of the Hollow Night Vigil, she rose and did not let them see her hand shake. The council chamber at Hollow Night was lit by more candles than Senna had ever seen gathered in one room, 100 small flames pressed back against a dark that gathered thick in the high rafters, and every seat at the long stone table was filled. Lady Iseult sat near the head in furs the color of old blood. Alpha Devrick of the Stone Pine Pack, broad and gray-bearded, occupied the guest's chair with the particular stillness of a man who had traveled far to witness a king either live or fall, and would report faithfully to his own pack whichever he saw. Garrow stood near the door in full armor, jaw tight, eyes flicking again and again toward the empty dais where the king's chair sat conspicuously bare. Corin Vases stood at the center of the floor like a man already crowned, and when the guards brought Senna in, chained at the wrists for show though she had offered no resistance, he turned to the assembly with the satisfaction of a hunter presenting a kill. "Behold the witch who poisoned our king," he said, and behind him 2 more guards brought Hesper in to stand beside her, frail and furious and silent. 9 years ago, this hold burned this woman's mother for crimes against the throne, Corin continued, warming to the room's attention. Tonight, her daughter finishes what that mother began. I ask the Council of 12 to confirm what every honest eye in this chamber already knows. The chamber held its breath the way a held storm holds a sky, and into that silence, the doors at the far end of the hall were torn from their hinges, not opened, torn. The iron bracing them, shrieking and giving way all at once as though something on the other side had simply decided the door no longer existed. Halric stood in the broken frame. He had risen from a sickbed he had no strength to leave 4 days past, and he stood now in the doorway with frost steaming off a body too large and too charged with restored power to belong wholly to a man any longer. His eyes burning gold in a way Senna had never seen them burn even at the height of his recovery, and the air in the chamber went suddenly, violently thin, the way air thins before lightning finds the ground. 12 lords of the council, every one of them, found their knees already bent before he had taken a single step inside. Even Devrick, envoy of a rival pack with no claim of loyalty in this hall at all, found his legs folding beneath him without his apparent permission. Only Corin remained standing, and only because shock had locked his knees in place rather than any will of his own. The great black wolf that had lain at the foot of the king's sickbed for so many slow weeks padded through the broken doorway behind him now, fully restored, moving with an ease no one in that chamber had seen from it before, and settled itself at the king's heel as though it had simply been waiting its whole life for this one room. The king crossed the floor in 5 strides that emptied the chamber of every sound but his own footfall, and stopped before Senna, and the gold burned out of his eyes as he looked at her, leaving behind only the man. "You stayed in that cell, rather than buy your life with a lie," he said, low enough that it should not have carried, and yet it reached every corner of that silent hall. "I will not let go of a woman who would not let go of the truth." It was the only soft thing he said that whole long night, and it was enough. He turned from her to Corin Vass, and the gold came back into his eyes like a struck flint catching. "Nightroot and silvered ash," he said. 3 winters in my wine. A confession bought with an old woman's freedom. You wanted a regency built on my grave, steward, and you built it instead on the one healer in this vale who could not be frightened into silence. Corin's mouth worked without sound, and behind him Garrow had already moved, 2 of his own guards turning their spears, not toward the king they had sworn to, but toward the steward who had spent 3 winters paying for their silence with promises of land that was never his to give. 9 years this vale called her mother a witch, and burned an innocent woman for the crime of curing the sick, the king said, turning at last to the full council, his voice carrying the particular weight of a proclamation rather than a man merely speaking. Tonight, every lord at this table kneels to the daughter that same veil tried to cast into the dark to die. Let the registries show it. Let the whole north hear it. I name Senna of the Hollow Wood my chosen mate, before this council, before Stonepine's witness, before the same hall that judged her unworthy of even a healer's mercy. The bond, when it broke open between them, was not the false coerced thing Corin had tried to name it before the council. It came instead as something Senna felt low in her chest, a warmth that had been building since the first night her bare hand had found the gray mark at his collarbone, releasing all at once into a single bright thread that ran from her heart to his, and steadied there, golden and unmistakable, and entirely, irrevocably hers. The chamber held the moment a long breath before anyone dared move again, the candles guttering low and gold across 100 bent heads, and in that hush even Lady Iseult, who had hoped for this very chair beside this very man, found herself sinking, very slowly, to one knee. They led Corin Vass from the hall in chains forged from his own broken authority, his steward's chain of office stripped from his throat by Garrow's own hand before the watching council, and within the month, the Vale's own law, the law he had been so eager to wield against an innocent woman, closed around him in turn. He would not see another Hollow Knight as a free man, and the eastern grazing lands he had tried to sell to Stonepine remained, by Devrick's own quiet insistence once the truth came clear, exactly where they had always belonged. Hesper was freed within the hour, wrapped in a guard's own cloak and fed broth that for once tasted of something, and she lived out the rest of that winter and many after it in rooms inside the keep itself, rather than a hut 3 miles into a wood that no longer needed to hide her. Her jars of dried roots and careful handwriting moved at last into a proper still room, with a fire that never had to be rationed. Senna's mother's name was struck from the registry of the condemned and entered instead among the honored healers of Ashvale Hold, 9 years and 1 season late, and the hollow wood, where Senna had once gathered ember balm at the risk of her own life, was declared, by the king's first proclamation, as a man no longer dying, a protected grove rather than a place of exile. Its standing stones marked at last with her mother's name, carved fresh into the rock beside the silver-leafed plant that had saved a king's life. In the quiet weeks after, when the keep had gone back to something like ordinary life, and the worst of the cold had finally begun to loosen its grip on the river, Senna found Halric standing at the same window where she had first watched frost spread across a pane, and thought, foolishly, that it was only weather. Sunlight, real and pale and unfamiliar after so long a winter, fell across the stone floor in a long, warm band. The great black wolf lay stretched along the warm stones near the hearth, eyes half closed, untroubled for the first time in a long while. He took her hand without a word, the same scarred hand that had gripped hers in a cell hour, and held it now in a hall full of warm firelight instead, and turned her palm upward to look at the small silver scar left where the ember balm had once burned its mark into her skin during that final desperate healing. A mark that would never fully fade, and that she had stopped, somewhere in the long weeks since, trying to hide. He bent his brow to rest against hers then, slow enough that she could have stepped back if she had wanted to. And for a long moment neither of them moved, content to let the closeness itself be the whole of what passed between them, unhurried, unclaimed by anything either of them needed to say aloud. Outside the window the river had begun, finally, to run again beneath its thinning crust of ice. A low, constant sound she had not heard in months and had nearly forgotten how to listen for. At her throat, where a hidden pendant of carved emberwood had once stayed buried beneath her collar for fear of what anyone might say if they saw it, the same small token now hung in plain sight, catching the firelight the way it had never once been allowed to in 9 long years. She did not look away from him to check who might be watching. No one left in Ashvale Hold would dare make her.